Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 341. We are just rolling through the 300s. I sometimes can't believe how many episodes I have recorded of this podcast. I've been at it for years and I love doing it. And I love that you're here and we have an opportunity to chat. If you're watching this on YouTube, hi. You can see me, which is a cool way to experience the podcast. And if you are watching on YouTube, leave a comment because I love to see comments, and it also makes it look like there's a little more activity happening on the episode, and YouTube will share it with more yoga teachers, which is part of the reason why I put it up there on YouTube. So please leave a comment. So today I'm going to be covering a particular topic about cueing. And I'm inspired to do this because number one, it never goes out of style. Number two, it is an amazing way to really bring more confidence to your teaching. When you understand the why behind the cue, it will transform you as a teacher. So in this episode, once we get to the end, you will have a way to evaluate the cues that you share so that you make informed choices about the best cues to share when you're teaching rather than teaching from a script. So let's talk a little bit. I'm just looking down at my notes here. Here are the notes. So if you're watching on YouTube, just want to let you know that. Let's talk about this idea of being a little more intentional when you are teaching and sharing your cues. So remember, there's these two aspects of teaching that are two of the main pillars of excellent teaching, cueing and sequencing. The other two pillars are mindset and anatomy. And I talk about that in my ebook. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the pillars of teaching and see a little bit of an expansion for each one, go to the link in my bio for Instagram, which is Bare Bones Yoga, and you can download the ebook there. For this conversation, we're going to focus on the cueing part. So now you have a sense of cues in the context of these four pillars, and above those four pillars is sort of this goal of teaching where you feel really confident and empowered, where you are an excellent, amazing yoga teacher. And this idea of being intentional when you share your cues is really different than repeating cues, saying the same things over and over again, repeating what you were told to say in your teacher training, sharing cues and you're not really sure of the reason for the cue. That, while it's not necessarily bad or wrong, and in fact, you may start there as a newer teacher, and that may be your introduction to cueing. It's just that at some point, I would bet you want to be the kind of yoga teacher who truly understands the reason for the cue you're sharing. And the reason for the cue lies in the anatomy. And the interesting thing is that even if you don't share the why with your students, understanding the rationale for the cue will change how you communicate it. And it will change it in a very specific way. It will change the conviction that you use when you share your cues. And by conviction, I don't mean a ruling in a court of law, I mean belief. When you share cues and you truly understand the reason for the cue, you will communicate that cue. You will share, you will say that cue with strong conviction. Your students will hear that cue clearly. They will hear the power in your voice. They will hear an unwavering sense of clarity. They will not hear that sort of, I don't really know what I'm talking about type vibe. They will hear you communicate the cue in a clear way that subconsciously communicates that you know exactly what you're saying and you know the why behind the cue. This is elevated teaching. Being able to teach in this way will elevate your classes and will be an illustration of a transformation that you have undergone as a teacher. And this is not for everyone. A lot of teachers will go their whole life teaching and being repeaters. But I bet if you're taking time out of your day to listen to my podcast, I bet you're the kind of yoga teacher who wants to teach in a way where you understand the why behind the cue, where you are making intentional choices for the cues that you're saying. You might even be the kind of yoga teacher who does the walk and talk. And by doing the walk and talk, you have eyes on your students. You can see how they're doing in the poses and give them cues in the moment that meet the moment of what they need. You know, there's a lot of talk these days, and I'm getting comments on my Instagram reels about knowing what students want and knowing what students need. And I really have a problem with those statements. I don't have a problem with the concept of helping students in terms of what they need, and maybe even making an effort or an attempt to give them what they want. The problem is we will never know that. We will never know what they need. We will never know what they want. We are teaching a group of people and they are not talking back. We are going in a room with a group of people, many of whom we don't know, and we're the only one doing the talking. We're not asking them as they practice, what do you need? We're not asking them as they practice, what do you want? So that we can't know that. The only thing we can know is what we see. And if we see a student out of alignment, we can offer an alternative or a corrective cue. But we'll never see that if we're doing the practice with me approach. Our only hope to do that is to teach with the walk and talk methodology, which I've talked about extensively in a lot of my episodes. If you'd like a video specifically on how to do the walk and talk, send me a DM on Instagram with the words walk and talk, and I'll send you the training video to help you get started. So I wanted to bring this up because this whole sort of esoteric yoga speak concept of giving students what they need, giving students what they want, when we look at it at the practical level, it's an impossibility. If they leave our class and they feel like they got what they want, bonus. If they leave our class and they feel like they got what they need, bonus again. We can't go into the class with that as our goal. Imagine how that would look. We go into the class, we've got 10 people in there, and we say, okay, go get your props. And as you're getting your props, I'd like each one of you to come up and tell me what you want out of today's class and what you need out of today's class. And then you had 10 individual directives. Obviously, you can't do that. You can't meet that need. You can't run your class like that. So the reason I'm breaking this down into painstaking detail is to show, quite frankly, how absurd this is. And at the same time, this is a belief that yoga teachers have from hearing other yoga teachers say this kind of stuff. I'm sure you've been with a group of yoga teachers or in teacher training, and you've heard teachers say, oh, well, I want to give my students what they need, or I go in to teach my classes and I'm giving my students what they need. I mean, the sort of thing, it just reeks of superiority. It reeks of overly neediness, like I'm taking over and telling you what you need. It does not, to me, come across as I see my students as whole people who have free agency to decide what they want or need from my class. And my role is to go in with a plan and to teach to the plan and to be walking around so that I can get these visual clues as to what corrective cues would meet the moment. That's a strategy that I can get behind. But to go in with this sort of pie in the sky idea that I'm going to meet the needs and the wants of all the students in my class, to me, is just yoga speak. At the practical level, it falls apart. And the reason this is so harmful is because the more you hear this sort of thing, the more you're going to believe that that's the right way to teach. And then you're going to go into your classes and you're going to realize there's no way I can actually know what they want or need. So what are these people talking about? And this is where I like to call BS on this stuff. Because the more these things are proliferated, these beliefs are proliferated, you'll hear them and you'll start to evaluate how you're teaching bumped up against this ideal that you've heard about. And most likely you'll decide, because there's no rational way you can be doing this, oh, I'm not doing this. I'm not meeting this bar. And then you'll feel badly about yourself. And I'm here to tell you that is not the truth. That is just a belief. That is just yoga speak. I'm speaking to you in plain, practical language at the level of teaching strategy. And even though that may sound like a mismatch for the mystical, philosophical yoga tradition, the reality is it's part of teaching. If we don't go in with a plan, then we don't know what we're doing. And we can go in with a plan and still speak to philosophy and energetics and mystical things. They both exist together. When it's just the one, that's where a lot of the confusion you might have comes from, because all of these terms and statements and beliefs are spoken in this language like this. Oh, the only way to know this is if you're a true yoga teacher. Then you'll know what your students need or want. And again, I call BS on that. So when we're talking here on this show, I'm going to give you the straight talk. Matter of fact, when you go to my Instagram, you'll see the profile page says, under my name, Karen Fabian, it says straight talk for yoga teachers. Because I'm just going to give it to you straight here. You don't have time to try to interpret a whole bunch of flowery terminology, esoteric language. So when you come here to the pod, or you go to my Instagram page, or you enroll in my program, I'm going to give you straight talk so that you can get to teaching out there in a way that you love and in a way that helps you feel confident and empowered. So with that, I want to ask you a question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you know the why behind your cues? And I'll just give you a minute to think about that as I take a sip of hot tea. How well do you know the why behind your cues? Think if you had a person in your class whose sole job was to question how much you knew about the cues you shared. And every time you shared a cue, that person said, why? Why do you want us to straighten our leg? Why are you saying we're stretching our hamstrings? Why are you asking us to squeeze around our sitting bones? Could you answer those questions? This is a legitimate, practical test to give yourself, to teach a class and reflect on the cues you use, or as you're teaching a class, listen for the cues you're using and see, do I actually know what I'm talking about? So that's what we're going to go over today, a strategy for sharing cues and understanding the cue that you're sharing. So I'm calling it how to evaluate your cues. So when we get into this, you'll get a sense of what that's all about. And keep in mind, this concept of the why behind the cue comes from, there's the cue that you say, and then behind it is the rationale, the reason for the cue. And you might not always share that. If you know it, though, you will share your cues with much more, as we said before, much more conviction, the belief that you know what you're talking about. Like, that's really what it is. Do you know what you're talking about? I remember one time a teacher said to me, I just want to feel like when I'm teaching my classes, I want to feel like I know what the heck I'm talking about. And I thought that so accurately encapsulated how so many yoga teachers want to feel. They don't want to feel confused. They don't want to feel less than. They don't want to feel like they're not an expert. They want to feel like they know what they're talking about. So my question to you is, when you're teaching your classes, do you feel like you know what you're talking about? If somebody started asking you questions about your cues, What would you say? I hope you wouldn't say, well, I'm just saying it that way because that's what I was trained to say. You are not a parrot. You are an adult person. You are a smart person. You do not want to go into your classes, I'm sure, and just be a repeater, right? You don't want to be the kind of teacher who's just going in there and just repeating the stuff they told you to say in teacher training. I don't think that's what you want to do. If that is what you want to do, then more power to you. I would guess, though, again, if you're listening to this show, you're a discerning yoga teacher. You envision teaching in a way that's authentic to you, which means using your own words. So with that, let's get into your cue evaluation template. And this is something that you can download. So as you're listening, remember you can go to the show notes and get the link to this and download it and have it on hand. So as you listen, you don't need to take any notes because you can download it after the show. So here are some things that I want you to consider to help you evaluate the cue. The first thing is look at the anatomical actions of the pose. So this is right out of the gate where you start to test your knowledge of anatomy. And if you find that you can't answer these questions, this is a sign that you've got a learning gap around anatomy. And honestly, you really shouldn't be teaching if you have a learning gap around anatomy. I don't mean to be harsh about it, but you really shouldn't. You really should fix that problem. But I know that you're going to keep teaching, so why not fix the problem while you're teaching? And in the meanwhile, just use action cues. Don't speak to the anatomy. And you can certainly enroll in my program, and I'll help you learn the anatomy. You can see the link to my program right in my bio and right on my website. My bio on Instagram and right on my website, right on the homepage, barebonesyoga.com. The first thing you'll see, work with me in my one-on-one program. Click that link. You'll see all the details of how you can work with me and I can help you fix that problem. It is a problem. Again, this is straight talk. I'm not here to say, oh, it's not a problem. Just keep teaching and don't understand the reason for your cues, which lives in the anatomy, but go ahead and keep doing that. I'm not going to say that because it's not a wise choice. It's not a wise choice. So the first thing, test your knowledge. Take a look at a bunch of pictures of yoga poses and see, can I identify the anatomical actions of the pose? If I'm looking at Warrior One and the arms are up in the air, what anatomical action is that? If I'm looking at tree pose, the leg that's the foot on the other leg, what anatomical position is that hip in? If I'm teaching Warrior Two, that leg that's back and straight, what joint movements is that hip doing and that knee doing? So these are all just exercises you can do to test your knowledge on anatomy. So one of the things to help you evaluate a cue is to look at the anatomical actions of the pose. Identify what joints are in action and what action they are performing. So an example would include actions like flexion and extension. And remember, these are actions of the joint and not actions of the muscle. The next thing is to look at the muscles involved, both concentrically contracting and eccentrically lengthening and passively lengthening. So this is the step 2 after you identify the joint movements of the pose to identify the muscles that are creating the movement. So in our example earlier of Warrior One, the arms up in the air, that's shoulder flexion. The concentrically contracting muscle is the pectoralis major, and the eccentrically lengthening muscle is the latissimus dorsi, aided by the teres major, which are primary movers of shoulder extension. The next one is to identify joints that might be at risk, might be compromised, depending on where they are in relation to the floor, or how they're weighted or impacted by gravity, or the anatomical action they're creating. So now that you have the anatomical actions identified, the joints involved, and the muscles concentrically contracting, look at how the joints are involved in supporting the overall structure of the body. So for instance, if you're in triangle pose, the lower knee of the front leg can be compromised because it's carrying the weight of the upper body as the torso leans over that leg. Another example is the position of the knee in half pigeon. As the shin moves medially on the bent leg side, the knee is taken out of its primary role, moving in the sagittal plane in flexion and extension. And we're leveraging its ability to move medially, but that's not the primary way it likes to move. It's better served moving in the sagittal plane in flexion and extension. So this is, again, part of your evaluating the cues you're sharing. The next factor is work to gain a better understanding of the rationale being expressed for the concern or guideline shared. So this is always the best place to start. And if you have a chance, you're taking a class and you hear a cue and you're not sure of the rationale for the cue, the best place to start is to ask the teacher, hey, why did you share that cue? Can I ask you a question about it? I'm trying to understand the reason for that cue. So for instance, if you're in class and the teacher says, hugging the knees into the chest after doing wheel pose is bad for you, and you're laying there hugging your knees into your chest and you're wondering, I wonder why that is. You could ask the teacher. Remember, you're just gathering information to try to understand what is the reason for that cue. Another factor to consider is considering the impact of the group versus the individual. So, bottom line, if we could teach classes privately, we'd have a chance to customize the pose to meet the needs of the person involved and right where they are at that moment. So let's say, for instance, they're having a hard time keeping their knees forward in chair. We could put a block between their thighs to encourage that straight ahead alignment. If they have a hard time keeping the head steady when moving in a low push-up, we could have them drop their knees or just lower slowly completely to the ground. These modifications help decrease the risk and increase the integrity of the pose. But in group classes, we just don't have the ability to give that kind of individual instruction. And we also have no information about what's going on in the bodies of the students, what injuries they might have, or even if they're listening to us. So this means that making broad statements or giving cues that provide a warning for all won't be a helpful approach, just as teaching in a way that encourages moving to the end range at every pose won't be helpful either. So when looking at a cue from an evaluation perspective, consider if it's too specific or too broad, and work to share cues that are somewhat in the middle and highly accessible for all. The next thing to consider is the impact of dynamic movement versus a static stretch. So once we start moving our students on the mat, there's a great deal more for the student to have to coordinate versus when we're holding them in a pose. When compared to a static posture, like holding them in a pose, it requires more coordination, let's say in sun salutations, for instance, and more awareness for them to be building proper alignment as they're moving through a certain part of the sequence. However, long holds in a static pose can present a similar challenge in that the longer the student holds the pose, the greater the chance they will lose some key part of the alignment. Think about if you're holding people in side angle lunge, you'll start to see that front knee waver medially as they hold the pose for 5, 6, or 7 counts. So when looking at a cue in this evaluation framework, consider if it's a cue that has to do with a dynamic movement or a static stretch and see how that impacts the overall picture. The other factor that hardly ever gets talked about is to consider the impact of frequency on the action. So something you do once or twice will have less of an impact on the body than something you do all the time, unless it's something like a sudden movement where the body is unprepared for the movement. So for instance, something like sun salutations is much more important to cue correctly than maybe that tree pose you're doing once or that bridge pose you're doing once. Let's say you're doing 3 big back bends, like 3 wheel poses. Really important because it's more frequent that your cues be clear and that you be watching your students so you can be sure they're in correct alignment. So now that you have some of these features of this framework, here's what you can do to put it into place. As you go into your classes, ask yourself as you're teaching your classes, what is a good format, an easy format for me to use to share anatomy and my cues? And keep in mind, we've got 4 types of cues: action, alignment, anatomy and somatic. And we're drilling down on the anatomy-based cue. This is the type of cue where usually this idea of the why behind the cue becomes such a big deal because we're speaking to the anatomy. And depending on how well you know anatomy, you may not know the why behind the cue. So once you learn it, one of the frameworks that I teach that makes them so easy to share is to share 3 action cues followed by 1 anatomy cue that speaks to one of the muscles concentrically contracting in the pose. So for instance, for Warrior 1, if you have your students in downward dog, you could say, step your right foot forward, drop your back heel, reach your arms up, and then draw your belly button in and lift the front edge of your pelvis, create a level pelvis. Or you could use the same action cues, but then instead say, engage the muscle of your back leg to fire up your quads to straighten the knee. You don't have to say what I say. What you can do though, and what I'm sharing with you is a framework, a cues framework. This is so much more powerful than a script because a script locks you into being a repeater. A framework gives you the freedom to speak from what you know. And when you speak from what you know, your confidence grows. So I hope you found this helpful. As I said before, the last thing to do after you're done listening to this episode is just go to the show notes and you will see that there is a link for this download so you can get all the details printed out and have it as an easy reference guide for you as you're teaching, not really as you're teaching, but to prepare for your classes and to really do a self-examination of how well do you understand the why behind the cue. The last thing I'll share is over the past several weeks, I've been having weekly meetings, workshops with the teachers in my month-to-month membership called the Yoga Teacher Confidence Club. And I want to just share with you some of the success stories from some of the teachers in the club. We meet once a week and we always have a different topic that I bring. And the teachers have an opportunity to learn on that topic and then share any questions they have. Over the past 3 months since I started the Yoga Teacher Confidence Club in December, we've covered things like how to share anatomy in your cues, how to bust through beliefs that might be holding you back from feeling confident, how to teach beginners, easy steps to learning what you need to know about anatomy, how to create a sequence with a peak pose, and several others. At this point to date, and I'm recording this on March 20th, 2025, we've done 10 workshops to date. And when you enroll in the Yoga Teacher Confidence Club, it's just $29, and you get access to all the workshops we've already done to watch as a replay. And then, of course, invitations to the upcoming workshops happening every week. So some of the success stories of the teachers in the club is teachers who have transitioned from practice with me approach to the walk and talk approach. That was actually one of the things we covered in a recent workshop. I've gotten a couple of emails from teachers saying because of their membership in the Yoga Teacher Confidence Club, they've learned how to do the walk and talk, and they've started experimenting with it in their classes. I've had a couple of teachers send me messages that they're absolutely loving the idea of sharing anatomy in their cues, and they're leveraging the teaching method that I shared in that particular workshop and starting to share more anatomy in their cues with greater confidence. I've had 2 teachers in the Yoga Teacher Confidence Club realize through their attendance at the weekly workshops that they are really ready to learn the anatomy, and they've upgraded to my one-to-one program. I've had teachers start to come out of their shell, and they've shared with me how much more comfortable and confident they feel teaching their classes because in the workshops, we've covered some of these things around limiting beliefs. So this is one of the fastest ways to build your confidence in teaching, in cueing, and sequencing. And if you'd like to join, the link is right on my website page, barebonesyoga.com. And it's also right off my Instagram, which is also Bare Bones Yoga. And you can get started for just $29 a month. So it is a great deal. With that, we'll end today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. and I'll talk to you again next week on the next episode of Conversations for Yoga Teachers. Namaste.